Why some European nations are turning away from Islamic immigration. In recent years, there has been a noticeable shift in immigration policies in several European countries. Islamic immigrants, who once found relatively welcoming shores, now face increasingly heightened barriers. This change is driven by a complex interplay of cultural, social, economic, and political factors. For policymakers, the challenge lies not just in understanding the reasons behind these changes, but also in addressing their long-term implications, both domestically and globally. This script will unpack the historical context, key issues, and ethical dilemmas surrounding Islamic immigration in Europe. It will also explore what sustainable and inclusive solutions might look like for policymakers navigating this contentious issue. Europe has long been considered a beacon of liberalism and multiculturalism. Throughout the 20th century, many European countries opened their doors to immigrants fleeing war, poverty, and persecution. Post-WW2 immigration waves allowed individuals from Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, many of whom were Muslim, to rebuild their lives on European soil. This policy reflected Europe's commitment to humanitarian principles and its acknowledgement of a shared global responsibility to protect displaced populations. Islamic immigrants, in particular, played a significant role in shaping European cities. They contributed labor to rebuilding economies, enriched cultural landscapes, and introduced Europe to diverse traditions and perspectives. Yet, even in those earlier years, integration challenges arose. Differences in language, religion, and cultural practices often created tensions that simmered beneath the surface. Today, those early tensions have evolved into tangible political and social divides, spurring more restrictive immigration policies. One of the most prominent reasons cited by European governments for limiting Islamic immigration is cultural integration. This concern is often framed as the preservation of national identity. Critics argue that a steady influx of migrants from vastly different cultural and religious backgrounds risks altering Europe's traditionally secular and relatively homogeneous societies. The debate often zeroes in on religious practices. From halal meat preparation to the wearing of headscarves and burqas, the visibility of Islamic practices in public life is seen by some as a challenge to regional norms. For instance, countries like France have implemented strict secularism to minimize religious displays in public spaces. However, such policies have also exacerbated feelings of alienation within Islamic communities. Opponents argue that immigration policies should respect cultural pluralism, not suppress it. But for populist leaders, emphasizing fears of losing cultural identity has proven politically effective. This raises a troubling question for policymakers. Is restricting immigration to protect perceived notions of cultural stability worth potentially deepening societal divisions? Economic arguments form another pillar in the case against Islamic immigration. A frequent claim by opponents is that incoming populations place an undue burden on public welfare systems, housing, educational infrastructures, and job markets. While undeniably valid in specific instances, this assertion often disregards the economic contributions immigrants make. Many migrants are eager to work and contribute to their new communities, filling labor gaps in industries ranging from construction to healthcare. However, far-right political narratives frequently highlight isolated cases of dependency to support anti-immigration sentiments. This creates a skewed perception, fostering resistance even in nations that would benefit economically from an expanded workforce. For policymakers, it is essential to evaluate these claims with data rather than populist rhetoric. Immigration policy should be viewed through an investment lens. What is spent on integration today may yield lasting economic benefits tomorrow. The question remains whether Europe can reconcile short-term pressures with long-term economic advantages. Public safety is perhaps the most emotionally charged aspect of the debate over Islamic immigration. In the wake of high-profile terror attacks in Europe, a toxic narrative has developed, often equating Islamic immigration with increased security risks. While it is true that a small number of individuals have exploited immigration routes for heinous acts, the overwhelming statistical majority of Islamic immigrants are peaceful and law-abiding. Nevertheless, these rare but tragic incidents have had outsized political and social consequences. They have been weaponized by far-right groups, fueling hysteria and justifying sweeping restrictions targeting Islamic populations. The result is an environment where fear overshadows facts, leaving policymakers in a precarious position. What is often ignored, however, is the role that integration plays in preventing radicalization. Immigrants who feel excluded or stigmatized are more vulnerable to social isolation and extremist influences. Therefore, focusing solely on restrictive policies may undermine long-term security goals. Instead, investments in inclusion and community building could provide a more sustainable way forward. Tied closely to these safety and cultural debates is the meteoric rise of nationalism and populism across Europe. Political movements that position themselves as defenders of traditional values have gained significant momentum in recent years. They capitalize on anxieties surrounding immigration, often exaggerating its challenges while ignoring its potential benefits. For instance, slogans promoting ideas like taking back control or protecting our borders have resonated deeply with segments of the population that feel marginalized by globalization. These dynamics create an echo chamber where any nuanced discussion about immigration is drowned out by fear-driven rhetoric. For policymakers, this trend poses a formidable challenge. Nationalist populism positions their decision-making as a choice between protecting their citizens or ceding control to outside forces. Navigating this dichotomy requires balancing cultural sensitivities, long-term economic interests, and ethical responsibilities. Media plays an outsized role in shaping public perception of Islamic immigrants. Sensationalist headlines and the selective focus on divisive events amplify stereotypes and exacerbate fears. A mosque being vandalized rarely gets the same coverage as the arrest of a suspected extremist, even if the latter is an outlier rather than the norm. Social media further complicates this issue, allowing misinformation and xenophobic narratives to spread unchecked. The consequences are palpable. Islamic immigrants are often demonized as the other, undermining efforts to foster understanding and coexistence. For policymakers, countering these narratives is as important as passing sound legislation. Communication strategies that humanize Islamic immigrants and emphasize shared values can help dismantle the stereotypes perpetuated by reckless media coverage. The shift toward restrictive policies has tangible consequences. Closing borders may reduce immediate pressures, but it also risks fracturing European societies. Immigrants, both Islamic and otherwise, already living in these countries may feel increasingly alienated under the shadow of exclusionary rhetoric. Additionally, such policies compromise Europe's long-standing commitment to humanitarian values. Many Islamic immigrants are refugees fleeing war, persecution, and poverty. By denying them sanctuary, European nations risk undermining international human rights principles. The economic impact cannot be ignored either. Aging populations and declining birth rates plague much of Europe, necessitating a sustained influx of workers to maintain economic growth. Turning away immigrants could exacerbate these demographic challenges. Policymakers also face pressing ethical dilemmas. How does one balance national interests with moral obligations? While prioritizing cultural cohesion and security is undoubtedly important, outright exclusionary policies risk eroding the ideals that have historically defined Europe: freedom, equality, and justice. Another unresolved ethical question is the treatment of refugees. The responsibility to protect those fleeing peril is enshrined in international law. But restrictive immigration policies directly conflict with this mandate, leaving thousands in limbo across refugee camps or treacherous migration routes. Europe's response to these dilemmas will shape its global identity for generations. Will the continent position itself as a bastion of humanitarian leadership, or will it retreat into a defensive, isolationist posture? While the challenges are daunting, solutions are not beyond reach. One critical priority is investment in integration programs. Education, language training, and job placement are essential in ensuring that immigrants can contribute to their new communities. Inclusive education also fosters cross-cultural understanding, reducing tensions over time. Policymakers must also promote narratives that emphasize the shared humanity of immigrants and host communities. Collaborative initiatives, such as interfaith dialogues and community-building projects, can help bridge divides and foster coexistence. Finally, Immigration policies should be data-driven rather than fear-driven. Focusing on robust vetting processes rather than blanket exclusions can address security concerns without resorting to discriminatory practices. Policymakers must highlight the potential of immigration as an opportunity for national renewal rather than merely a challenge to be mitigated. The hesitation around Islamic immigration in Europe stems from an intricate web of historical anxieties, economic pressures, and political movements. For policymakers, the task at hand goes far beyond drafting exclusionary laws. It's about shaping the future of their countries in a manner that aligns stability with inclusion, pragmatism with ethics. A retreat into isolation and fear may provide short-term respite, but risks undermining Europe's core values and long-term prosperity. The answers lie not in division, but in shared effort, fostering dialogue, building bridges, and upholding the commitments that make Europe a symbol of hope for so many around the world. As the proverbial doors of opportunity grow narrower for immigrants, it's worth asking, what kind of society does Europe envision for itself? One that fears difference, or one that recognizes the strength in diversity? The answer to that question will define the future of not just Europe, but its role on the world stage.